Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
Hello, I am Crystal Downing.
And I'm David Downing.
And the two of us are delighted to have today two Tolkien scholars. First, our own resident Wade Tolkien scholar, Laura Schmidt. Thank you so much for joining us, Laura.
Great to be here.
And we also have a returning scholar who has spent a lot of time doing research in the reading room, Holly Ordway, who has a book coming out on Tolkien. Thank you so much for joining us, Holly.
Well, it's my pleasure to be back and to be here.
Let's talk about this new film. I would like to hear from each of you what you think is the greatest strength of this new film about Tolkien's early life. Laura, why don't you start us off?
Okay, well, I think the greatest strength right off the bat is most people probably who have gone to the theater and seen this film knew next to nothing about Tolkien's early life or about his life in general. So just coming away with a lot of the basic facts and the personalities and the characters that were involved in his story, I think is really great. I think it's a win for everybody who goes to see it.
How about you, Holly?
I think one of the strengths of it that I saw was its attention to the aesthetic of Tolkien's early years. There was a lot of sort of the arts and crafts imagery and art in the background. I noticed a number of William Morris wallpapers, and this is significant for his formation artistically and visually. And so I was really pleased to see. I even recognized, there was Strawberry Thief as one of the wallpapers up on one of the rooms, and I was really pleased to see that.
Yeah, that attention to detail. What about you, David?
And I'm David Downing. That worked last time, right? Oh, you want something different? I think just to see his life in context with all the horses in the streets and the primitive machinery they're using and even their costumes, I think it's wonderful to remember the era out of which he evolved his writing. People now think of him as very contemporary, probably because of the films and other fantasy stories. But I think it really made you realize what a historical precedent that was for him to be writing extended fantasy.
Yeah. I love the fact that they showed him towards the end of the film using a dip pen to write that first line from The Hobbit, because we have the dip pen here at the Wade Museum where he wrote much of his great work. How about what you see as a deficiency in the film?
I was pretty disappointed in the portrayals of Rob Gilson and Father Francis Morgan. I think those are two people that are so important to Tolkien's life, and they really changed their personalities.
Give an example.
Well, Rob Gilson is more like how they portrayed G.B. Smith in the film. He was very sensitive to beauty. He was really a good comrade as far as very personable, very friendly. And they made him kind of the troublemaker in the film because he was the headmaster's son.
Right.
So I was disappointed to see that transformation in him. And Father Francis, you can say what you like about the conversations they had with him, but he just didn't get enough airtime. You really couldn't see that strong relationship with Tolkien other than the fact that he's pictured with him at the end.
Well, I would say the major deficiency that I saw very, very blatantly was the almost total absence of any reference to his Catholic faith. And this is not limited to the film. It's something that's pretty pervasive in scholarship and popular writing about Tolkien. But it's a huge gap because Tolkien was a devout Catholic through his whole life. And he was very devout as a young man. So it's not something that developed later, as he grew up and had children or what have you. He was really a devout Catholic, a serious one. He served Mass daily at the oratory, which was, walking distance from his home in Birmingham. It was a major part of his life, and it's really important to his writing, to his work. It was also very important to his vision of the TCBS, the Tea Club and Barovian Society, that his friends at King Edward's School formed, something that was completely missing from the presentation of that society in the film. Although it was portrayed, I think, pretty accurately in terms of the dynamic, it missed out the fact that the boys, all of them, had an explicitly Christian underpinning to their vision of how their society was going to change the world. It was intentionally and explicitly Christian from all of them. And for Tolkien, that, was a Catholic vision. And I was just really sorry to see, first of all, some of the really great dramatic moments that they just missed out on. Because, for instance, you wouldn't know this from the film, but his mother Mabel, who she mentions early in the film that they're very poor. Well, why were they poor? It's because she converted to Catholicism and her family cut her off.
Wow.
And so Tolkien had to struggle with knowing that his mother didn't get the health care that she needed that could have at least extended her life, because her own family had denied her because of her faith. And he later said that Father Francis, his guardian at the oratory, who looked after him and his brother after his mother's death, Father Francis, he wrote, taught him forgiveness. So he had to learn to forgive. I assume he's referring to forgiving his extended family who left his mother to die in poverty.
Wow.
And that was specifically, and Tolkien remembered it this way, an issue of her sticking to her faith, because had she given up and gone back to being Church of England, she would have been welcomed back into her family. So it was a genuine sacrifice for what she believed. And Tolkien stuck with that.
Almost like a martyrdom, because the impoverished conditions probably contributed to her early death.
And so Tolkien knew very early on that to practice his faith was going to mean sacrifice. And that's hinted at. There's a phrase about sacrifice, his mother's sacrifice in the film, but you don't get the full resonance of it unless you know that it was a sacrifice of faith.
Right.
And even just the fact that being a Catholic in England at that time is very much a minority position.
Yes.
So part of his lower social status would have been that, it was only not that long before that Catholics were not allowed to be at Oxford.
Right. Not until 1871.
Right. So it was a new thing, relatively speaking. And one of the reasons that Tolkien chose Exeter College was probably because it was one of the more Catholic-friendly colleges in Oxford. So again, all this tension and that's just left out.
And that's interesting you bring up tension, because that is something that works in cinema. It's really hard to portray earnest faith in cinema. One of the issues that filmmakers must always deal with is what I call the externalizing of the internal. And so much about faith is internal. And one of the things that annoys David and I when we're watching films is how often you see people barfing on screen. I mean, it's a literal externalizing of the internal, and it's always done to show the person is upset. But how often do any of us see people when they get upset just throw up? But it's the only way they know to communicate, because you have to have something that is visual. So what you're describing there could have been visualized in interesting ways.
There's our title for this episode, Barfing on Screen. I think that's the podcast episode. I wanted to follow up on Miss Bet, because he did feel his mother was a martyr to Catholicism. She had diabetes and she died a year before synthetic insulin was invented.
Wow.
But normally they wouldn't be considered orphans. They would be adopted by one of the father's family or Mabel's family. And I think it would have made a great scene if they said, well, now that your mother's gone, if you all are willing to reconvert, because she converted rather late after her husband died. And he could just say, no, in the name of my mother and my faith, I'm not going to. That would have made a great, I think that would have been acceptable dramatic license.
That could have been externalized it nicely, right?
Yes.
They kind of invented some episodes that had nothing to do with Tolkien's life when they had some material right there in front of them. And I almost see it, Dickens always makes good storytelling because he has the mean people and then the kind people. And I can see a setup where Father Morgan is really the rescuer. He's like the Dickensian hero. I mean, he paid the money for this great private school. He took them on vacation. He was really a father figure. I was also disappointed that he was treated as kind of the typical authority figure of, I saw you leaving Edith's room last night. Oh, we were just talking.
Right.
To me, that's kind of a cliche.
He wasn't fully antagonized, but you do not get much of the warmth of that relationship and the real caretaker that he was for the boys for a long time. Yeah. And just to comment on your mention, Crystal, of externalizing the internal, Stephen Colbert actually asked the director, Dome Karukoski, directly, why did you not include more of Tolkien's Catholic faith? And his response was just what you said. It's very difficult to show that in film. externally when it's an internal and a private thing. So I think he was challenged in that. If they didn't have screenwriters that were up to the challenge, they just didn't go there.
But I think too, they really again missed some low hanging fruit, because especially for a Catholic, it would have been just very easy. Put a crucifix on the wall of their bedroom, put a rosary on the bedside table, show him walking into the into the Oxford Oratory when he's in Oxford, or into the Birmingham Oratory, which you would not know from the film was literally within sight. Beautiful, big dome, fantastic interior. They showed him, walking around, going to school. Why not show him walking through the church? Why not show him, one of those cut scenes where you just see him momentarily growing up? Show him praying, kneeling at at the altar rail. There's a lot of just visuals, that they could have done that would have just shown that being Catholic was part of his life without having to go into what that meant to him personally. But the rosary, a prayer card, a missal, a Bible on the bedside table. There are lots of ways that they could have done that. Now they did have the life-size crucifix that shows up very
In the
briefly
battle scene.
in the battle
Yes.
scene. And I thought, well done, filmmakers, because that's the kind of thing that really resonated with his spirituality. He would have thought of that. But for heaven's sakes, if you can put a crucifix in the battle scene, put a crucifix on the wall of his bedroom.
Yes, that would make so much sense.
We may see some of those cut scenes
right.
in the DVD extras, because I know they did do some films like having Tolkien in Confession and other things. So I'm curious to see what those will be like when it comes out.
Well, they pulled it off in Chariots of Fire really well. Sometimes it
That's
can be in the
right.
dialogue. Someone's faith doesn't have to be totally internal. They can
That's
talk about
right.
it as well as all the
of
visual
Fire
imagery.
did it well. We have become so used to those external images, like a Bible, like genuflecting, as signs of hypocrisy in faith, where it is only an externalized expression of faith. And you almost wonder if the filmmakers were saying, okay, we don't want people to misinterpret. But I think some of your suggestions are the filmmakers could have learned from you as how it could have been done.
Another thing that's hard to externalize is the life of imagination. And to me, it was a little weak. What set him apart was incredibly vivid imagination. Even in these early years, he was already writing so much of that early material that was later published after Lord of the Rings. When I see a film like this, I want somebody to give me $10 million and I want to reshoot it. I would have loved, he just sees a word in a book like Irindil, or he sees some of those other famous lines that were so stimulating to him. And suddenly we go into his imagination and we see all these things going on in his head, like his image of Irindil voyaging through the ocean. And then somebody calls him back to reality. Lewis said that there was a period of my life where I lived almost entirely in imagination. And I think that's pretty true of Tolkien as well. I'd love to see more creative ways to access his imagination without, at the end he writes in beautiful calligraphic writing, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. But I didn't get enough glimpses early on about how intense his imagination was, even before the war scenes.
Once again, how do you externalize that, the internal workings of the imagination?
Well, give me $10 million and I'll show you how.
Okay, I want to hear personally what was your favorite scene from the whole film. Laura, what was your favorite scene?
I was so excited to see people that I'd read about finally brought to the screen. That was really great for me. And so when I was thinking about this, I'd have to go with the TCBS when they first are going into Barrow stores. I mean, I've seen that building. I knew they met there. They were having their tea and they were so alive, and when you know their stories and sad things happen to the members later, no spoilers here. Maybe we'll talk about that later. I don't know. But to see their friendship and camaraderie was such a big thing for Tolkien. His whole life, he really needed that support, that fellowship with other people, creatively as well as just socially. So to see them forming those friendships when they were young and vibrant was just really meaningful to me in general.
What about you, Holly?
Probably my favorite was his interactions with Professor Wright, played by Derek Jacobi. And I thought Jacobi did a really great job in the little amount of screen time that he had.
He's pretty great in general.
Well,
I
yes.
know, yeah. I mean, he's the most famous actor in the whole film.
So I thought that captured a little bit of the vision of Tolkien as an academic that I think the film needed, and finally had a little bit there, where you get finally a glimpse of Tolkien's intellectual ability, because Wright says, well, write me 5,000 words on this, this linguistic topic, and it kind of cuts very abruptly, but evidently you see that he did, because he becomes a student of Wright's in Wright's department. And I think that kind of gives you a bit of a glimpse of what Tolkien was really about, that he wasn't just larking about with his friends. He really was incredibly intelligent and devoted to language, and this was his opportunity to prove it. And I just liked that interaction there.
Mm-hmm. You know what I liked, and this is relevant to this whole issue of externalizing the internal. I really like the scene where he and Edith are going out to the fancy restaurant, and she is at first feeling self-conscious because all the other women have hats, but pretty soon it becomes a focus on her encouraging him to use his imagination. So I thought that was a smart way to do what David is talking about, where she says, well, what would the character say then? What would it do? And so he is in conversation with another person who is drawing out the power of language and the whole enjoyment of the word cellar door. And so it's not just about the meanings of words, it's about the beauty of language. And of course, I mean, he invented languages, and I think it's largely because of the beauty of language.
Oh, yeah. He combined elements of different languages that he just thought were beautiful and said, I'm going to use this one, that one, this one.
I thought it was kind of cute that the director of this film is Finnish, and he made sure to insert a reference to the fact that the Finnish language had influenced
Definitely
Tolkien.
caught that one, yeah.
Yeah, and that's something I didn't know.
Well, that's something else I would have liked to see. He really did love the word cellar door. That was one of his favorite words, so that was well chosen. I could see scenes where he's younger and he and his brother are watching the coal trains go by to and from Wales, and somebody says, "Oh, I never knew you loved trains so much." And he says, "No, it's not the trains; it's those words." I think you could have inserted those several places. On the Finnish, when he first found a Finnish dictionary, I can't imagine something more dry and off-putting than a Finnish dictionary. He says, "It's like I discovered a hidden wine cellar," and I could just see a lovely scene in which somebody picks up the book and they say, "What's happened?" And they're totally baffled. It could have been Edith. Edith is Edith Bratt, his girlfriend later, fiance and wife, but it could have been someone else. So I had a feeling of missed bets that were much closer to biographical points of his life than some of what we saw.
Well, even another missed opportunity was his relationship with his mother, who taught him his early languages. He was schooled at home for the first few years of his life, and so well that he was able to go into this really academically strong school. Actually, that was another sort of, again, missed opportunity. Why did they move closer into Birmingham and give up the more idyllic location? It was so he could go to a better school, because he had a long trek to get in there. So it wasn't arbitrary. It wasn't just because of poverty. It was that Mabel wanted her sons to have a really great education, and this was the way they were going to do it. But I think we could have seen, and that would have also strengthened the drama of losing his mother, that his mother was an intelligent, strong woman who educated her sons at home and did it so well, and helped inculcate that love of language into Tolkien at a very young age.
They do mention that he knew several languages, and of course the scene where he can stand up and recite Chaucer from memory. So we assume that the mother was doing this, but the moment they choose to show us is her storytelling, which is beautiful too for a bedtime story, and they have some dramatic effects with lighting and shadows and things
magic
like
lantern.
that. But yeah, it would have been interesting to have like a lesson in language with their mom too.
And she loved calligraphy. I would like some end pieces where we see her doing some calligraphy, and at the end, when he does In a Hole in the Ground That Lived, it would be a callback to remembering his mother. That would have been.
There is a professional calligrapher somewhere up her family tree, I think. So her teaching, that at home. So everything really that his mom instilled in him, love of botany, art, languages, storytelling, that all lasted a lifetime, and religion for Tolkien.
implied it, but it was so subtle. I think a lot of people missed it insofar as they kept the figures from the magic lantern that she shows her sons very early. And we would occasionally see magic lantern images moving across the walls. The implication being this, what is inspiring him, goes back to his mother. But I think a lot of people are not going to catch that.
It'd be interesting to just look at use of light and shadow in that film. I was just thinking back on the TCBS shadows on the road too. When they're walking, they choose to zoom in on that picture.
Right.
So,
Yes, that struck me as well with the bird's eye view shot, looking down at them, so we see their shadows.
Well, it fits Tolkien. I mean, light and shadow come up so much in his books, especially Lord of the Rings. Isn't that one of the names for Sauron, the shadow or the shadow in the east?
I mean, the Dark Lord.
The Dark Lord. Yeah.
I mean,
It's not a big stretch to use light and shadows.
yeah, no, you're right. I love light imagery, and I think that love was definitely instilled from reading The Lord of the Rings at a young age. So cool stuff.
And there, that scene with his mother, it was interesting to me in that it did provide a connection with some of Tolkien's reading as a young man, because she's not just making up that story; she's retelling the story of Sigurd and the Dragon of Fafnir, which was a story that Tolkien encountered as a boy in Andrew Lang's Red Fairy book. And it's a condensed version of it that Andrew Lang did. And Tolkien later recalled that was just a transformative story for him. It was so powerful. It introduced him to what he called the strong meat of fairy tales. And so it was actually probably he read it himself rather than having his mother tell the story, I would imagine. But I did like that it was connecting to a story that really was important for him as a young man, even though it's not identified in the film.
Another point they could have made with the dragon motif. He says when he was young, he started a story saying, "There once was a green great dragon."
Right.
And his mother said, "No, it was a great green dragon." And he says, "I didn't understand then why that was the wrong word order, and I still don't understand." That would have been a cute moment to put early into the story to go with all the dragon
Here
imagery.
he invents languages and still can't explain that.
Mr. Director of Movie out there, director of the movie, if you can hear me, please give me a call.
One of the things I liked about the film was the intercutting between childhood experiences and then experiences of the war. Because that was a cinematic technique that is implying that the war was this constant presence. And during the war, he reflected back on his childhood, and then after the war, he's reflecting back on his experience in the Somme. And the implication being, of course, that various images that appear in his novels came out of the horrors of war itself.
This is a spoiler alert, but I don't remember that Tolkien was killed during the war. Is that correct?
I will say one comment about the war scenes that I thought was very helpful as a viewer to know, and I didn't know it the first time, but I knew it the second time I saw the film. Now, the director comments that these war scenes might not be literal war scenes. It could be thought of more dreamlike sequences while Tolkien's in the hospital recovering. So for me to realize these are more emotive or dreamlike experiences in those war scenes rather than literal, he's crawling through the trenches looking for his friend, which didn't make much sense to me in the first place. And having someone named Sam as his, Batman and things like that. Like, that's kind of a solid hat tip there. I don't know. But I appreciated them more when I thought of them as visual dream sequences instead of literal war memories. That helped me as a viewer appreciate them more.
And that might help viewers who watch the film after listening to this podcast.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any other suggestions from the rest of you that about things you wish you had thought of more before you saw the film?
Well, in some ways, it's hard with war scenes not to go with the darkness, but there's also Gandalf and Aragorn and Faramir, and he always had a balanced worldview. He wasn't one of these hardy-esque pessimists. I would have liked for them to found a way, in some ways, from the TCBS, you got the sense that this fellowship was ruined. Spoiler alert, few of them do not survive the war, 2 of them. I could have seen him recreating the fellowship in the Inklings. He was a real clubby person. It was always, the TCBS, and then he went on to a group at Leeds, and then it was the Coal-Biters, and then the Inklings. I could even see at the end, the Hobbit, rather than wife and family, that Lewis is poking his head in and says, how's the story coming? Because in some ways he was always able to recreate that band of brothers. And I think there could have been a little bit more optimism or a little bit more balance throughout the story. Maybe I'm just too much.
That letter from G.B. Smith at the end, which I'm fairly certain is a real document. I remember reading that text.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
That I thought was well done. That they included that.
The essence of that letter is, our light will not go out should I not survive the night. You can carry on and do what we've left undone, and change society through art and faith.
Yeah. So I have a question for you that I haven't been able to figure out. Although I always have theories. I have theories about everything. But did you notice that in the first 4 or 5 scenes in which we see Edith, who eventually became his wife, who we met as an adolescent, we first see her in mirrors. And they kept using this mirror motif. And then once they fell in love, we didn't see the mirrors anymore.
There's that one Starbucks cup, but other than that, we didn't see. No, I'm sorry. That was that other, excuse me.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that, but he does see her first around a doorway and you see her reflection. And yeah, I'm not sure unless it's more of you see a vision of someone before you actually get to know them kind of a thing, almost like the Baron and Luthien love story, just captivated by her beauty at first. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Holly?
Yeah, I don't know. I admit that when I was watching that relationship, I liked the way that they gave the personality of Edith. She seemed like the kind of person that Tolkien could fall in love with. She was a positive portrayal, but I couldn't help just thinking about missed opportunities of the narrative the whole time. I mean, little things like in reality, Edith, her passion was to become a concert pianist, and she was actually frustrated that her landlady wouldn't allow her to play the piano because landlady didn't like the extra noise, and that becomes reversed, and she's just sort of a generically frustrated. I don't know what I want to do with my life, but I want to get out of here. And I thought that was actually less interesting than the Edith who wanted to be a professional musician, but was thwarted by her circumstances. So again, that was a little bit of a missed opportunity, or the fact that she actually got to know the boys because their landlady didn't feed them enough, and so she would send up on a rope baskets of extra food that she would filch and send them up to Hillary, and
that would have been great.
Yeah.
Because they were on a different floor, and then he would hang out the window and chat with her from one floor to the next. And this is so much more visually interesting. Baskets of food going up inside of the house, and then what they did, which was sort of generic. And I just have to get this out of my system. One, the way that they closed out, spoiler alert, the relationship. Well, it's so much more dramatic. I want listeners to this podcast to know that the real life story of their romance was so much more exciting. He did accept, that he wasn't to see her while he was at Oxford, but rather than the kind of, there were some letters they wrote to each other and they met up, he abided by his agreement. He did not contact her until midnight on his 21st birthday.
Wow.
He wrote her a letter and posted it. How romantic! Only to find that she was engaged to another man. Went there and convinced her to marry him instead. And they did get married before he went off to the war. And then another interesting little detail, she followed him, as closely as she could, moving to where his training camps were. And then when he went off to war, he wrote to her. And see, he wasn't supposed to let her know where they were, posted. But he found a way by a kind of code involving pinpricks in the letters to secretly let her know where his battalion was, which would have gotten him in a lot of trouble if they'd figured it out, because the censors were supposed to obliterate any references. So here you have him, devising a secret code to communicate with his wife, back home. How just romantic and sweet. And we get a typical Hollywood last look as he heads off to war.
Right. Or even the typical Hollywood adolescent image of he gets this letter, she's engaged, and so he just gets falling down drunk.
Yeah.
And you go, oh my goodness, that could have been written by a 12-year-old. Whereas what you're describing, people would say, oh, that couldn't have really have happened. That's just too amazing. And that's what really did happen. Wow.
Yeah, if he'd put in the letter, we'll always have Paris, the censors would have figured out what he was talking about, right?
Right.
That is true. Are there other, I wouldn't want to dwell too much on missed opportunities, but some of the things like going to the back scene of the opera house, did anything of that sort happen, or was that all invented? It was romantic.
Invented to the best of my knowledge.
As far as I know, completely invented.
Yeah.
I'm not a purist when it comes to that kind of thing. I'm completely okay with inventing things to fill out characters when it advances a story, when it's interesting. And I thought that the scene with the opera house, it demonstrated that they were poor, and that this would result in some embarrassment. And it also demonstrated that they were clever, inventive, imaginative. So even though there's no factual basis that I know of,
and the Wagner influence too, obviously.
Right.
So that I thought that was legitimate imagining in which they found a way to show this developing relationship and show their imagination and creativity. What just gets my goat is when they missed things that they could have done. They
could have done more with dancing in the glade. He really fell in love with her, and the Baron and Luthien myth is based upon that idea.
But
I can see
it's
them
in there.
develop that. Yeah, they mention it, but I think
Oh, they have a
instead
scene
of the
of
one
her
in the back of the
dancing, too.
what? Excuse me.
They have a scene of her dancing.
No, I remember they have the scene, but I would like the scene rather than the made-up scene in the opera house. I would rather them walking and she suddenly does this beautiful, elegant dance.
Well, they actually do have a scene of her dancing among the trees, but it's so generic that you almost miss it. And in fact, in real life, again, the real life version is more interesting. He recalls that she was dancing among the hemlocks, which in England, in that area, they're like Queen Anne's lace, but giant. I mean, they grow like 5 or 6 feet tall. So you've got these 6-foot tall bushes of white, lacy flowers, and you have Edith dancing amongst these flowers. That's a much more vivid image than just her twirling around a couple of generic trees, which is what we get in the movie.
Well, they had to film in the fall. I don't know.
Did Edith ever meet the TC?
That was another thing I thought, I don't remember this happening.
It
and
didn't.
Tolkien really did keep his personal life separate from his social life. And that was interesting that they brought them together in the film. And I think that moment where she expressed after they left frustration with not having a social group of her own, not being able to share her interests with other people, that was kind of a conflation with later Edith.
That's true.
Because she was home raising the kids. She didn't have the career that Tolkien had. And I think that I've heard or read several places that she was a little frustrated with finding community. So that's a way, again, to bring some of her characterization to the film, but again, out of chronological order and kind of putting things together in different puzzle shapes than we're used to reading or thinking about. So I wasn't too bothered by it because today it would be natural to introduce your girlfriend to your friends. This happens, but at that point, Tolkien didn't do that to the best of my
And it was, less strange than it would be now because, it was somewhat more typical in that age for men and women to have more compartmentalized social lives. So it wasn't particularly weird on Tolkien's part. He was maybe a little more reticent about introducing her eventually when, letting his friends know that he was engaged. But I think that might have been just natural shyness. But in terms of keeping the group separate, he wasn't deliberately excluding. It was just not the way that, people tended to do things at that point.
Right.
Well, with the Inklings later on, people idealized them as a band of brothers, but their closeness took its toll on their domestic relationships. I know that Charles Williams' wife, Tolkien's wife, Lewis's adoptive mother, even Owen Barfield's wife, they all felt, why are you spending so much time with the guys? I'm glad they were writing classic literature rather than playing poker. But there was a certain trade-off in terms of being that close with a bunch of fellow writers and scholars and not having time for other things.
Although I have to admit, I was somewhat irked by the last scene where you get the idea that he's been locked up in his room and ignoring his family, and they're sad. They've left him as dirt. When in fact, Tolkien made a point of spending more time with his family than the average Oxford Don. He came home every day for lunch to have that meal with his family, and that was not typical behavior by Oxford professors. So he was more family aware, and he made more of an effort to spend time with his family than his other male colleagues. And you wouldn't know that from that sort of sad, you've been neglecting your family scene at the end.
Right. And lots of storytelling. I mean, The Hobbit started as bedtime stories with his kids.
Exactly. Every year
Christmas letters, all that good stuff. So,
And wasn't there a story of a big hollowed out willow tree that it was so large the kids could climb inside of it? Somewhere I read that those big willows, that would have been just a fun visual reminder of how much of his fictional material came from actual experiences, once again, with the little kids. Well, do you all have any summations, thumbs up, thumbs down, see the movie in order to understand the writings, go straight to the books again? What are your summations about the film?
Well, I would say I'm glad that the film exists, even though I admit that I found it to be somewhat dull as a film, to be perfectly honest. And I wish that they had taken more use of the material they had with them. But it wasn't bad, and it was as a film. And I think it's good in that, as Laura said, it brings Tolkien in front of people and makes them aware that, oh, he actually had kind of a cool life. And then they'll discover that, in fact, his life was ever so much more interesting even than this movie presented to them.
Yeah.
So I would, encourage anybody who, sees the movie and thinks, oh, that was kind of neat. I would encourage them to read more about Tolkien, and in particular to go to John Garth's book, Tolkien and the Great War, which is fantastic. And then to read a biography. Now, the standard recommendation of a biography is Humphrey Carpenter's biography. It's the only authorized one. It is, however, a fairly flawed biography in some ways. Carpenter didn't actually have a very good attitude about Tolkien, and I think there are some issues. He portrays him almost as a stereotyped academic, and he's very negative in some ways about Tolkien. And I don't think get quite an accurate portrayal of him overall. It's still indispensable for readers, but it's not ideal. I would point readers to Raymond Edwards' biography called just Tolkien as a nice balance to that, and to Diana Gleyer's work on the Inklings, Bandersnatch, or The Company They Keep.
Right. The thing about Carpenter's biography is he bought the thesis that they didn't influence each other. And I think Dr. Gleyer's book is really important for showing how much they did influence each other. Laura, can you give a quick URL to your blog? You had a really thoughtful essay about, is it possible to give
I do not know the URL off the top of my head, which is shameful, but it is Sunlit Fields, and it's on WordPress, and anybody can message me, email me. I'm happy to send you a link to it. That gives my full thought on the movie, but I will say my just very simple statement is anybody should go to see the film that's interested. I honestly think they should, and come away with their own opinion rather than just rely on other people's opinions and what they're thinking about the film. If they know nothing about Tolkien, they'll learn something, and that's great. I liked the film overall, but I didn't love it. Okay, so I was content that we didn't have the Hollywood version of, hey, his best friends were named Merry, Frodo, and Pippin, because that's what Hollywood can sometimes do.
That, yes.
And there was far less changed than I had feared. There were plenty of missed opportunities. Is there more that could have been done or should be done? Absolutely. And I hope someone else makes another film version of Tolkien's life, and we can get all those extra tidbits, hopefully, that we're so hungry after. But maybe this will inspire them to do just that.
Right.
So that's something hopeful to leave
Maybe
on.
Netflix will put out a whole series there.
You never know. They're known to do that.
Well, thanks again for joining us. It's really been an interesting conversation, and I appreciate your spending time with us to talk about the film.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
And it was a pleasure to be on again.